Hi YouTube, Josh here, normally on the channel ZZZ Giant Awake, but it is Saturday on the Breakfast Club. More like Sunday now, but you get the idea. So I get to be the first to say, welcome Wayne. I'm actually really glad that you're on the channel. You have raised a bunch of questions that I haven't had to deal with in a minute, and it's kind of refreshing to go back to some of the questions and kind of reflect on my journey from being a Mormon to where I am now. So, I'm going to kind of break down parts of your video. I don't have time to cover the whole thing, and I wasn't able to script it out and do a fancy schmancy version of it. So, you talked about why you believe in God, and you said you'd find it depressing, which it can be. The process can be depressing and difficult. So, I recommend that you find some friends in your area who are atheists or deists or share some common leaving of religion that you're going through. Then you also mentioned that no one knows, like hard knows, whether God is real or not. I would have to agree with you on that. You asked if there was Gnostic atheists and Gnostic theists. Now, I'm kind of biased towards epistemology and philosophy, where there's really not much that can be said to be known in the hard sense. So when you're talking about that, I would have to think that religious Gnosticism has to be mystical. It has to have supernatural properties. And there are people who claim to be Gnostic Theists. The one that comes to my mind is less than 5 miles away from me. There's the Mormon temple and the housing for the prophets and apostles of the Mormon church, who get direct revelation from God and Jesus Christ. That way they can lead the people of the Mormon church. If I believe that they weren't being at least dishonest with themselves, I might still be a member, but of course that's so ludicrous to me now. That's so ludicrous to me anymore. Now, as far as Gnostic atheists, of course, there can't be an atheist who knows beyond the certainty of a doubt that God does not exist. Now, I'm going to get to something on that later where I think there might be an exception to be said about that. And I think that there have been some solid arguments, one that I'm familiar with that I'm not going to get into in this video, about why it seems unlikely that God could exist for very natural reasons, but that'll be another time. One of the things that you said, though, is that doubt is not an enemy of faith. And I find that weird. I think there's not really much that I take on faith. Trying to think, like, I think the one and only way that I use faith, not talking about whether I trust somebody, because you can use trust instead of faith. Like, do I trust my spouse? The only other time I use faith is kind of hand in hand with hope. Like, I have faith that tomorrow is going to be better, or the future is going to be better than it is presently in my life, at least. But I don't think that there's faith that God does not exist. I don't think that logically makes sense. I think that it is completely non-contradictory to believe that God doesn't exist not on faith. And it's not the positive belief, it's the lack of faith in God. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, if you don't have faith that the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist, you don't have faith that fairies don't exist. Faith is not the correct term there, because it doesn't take faith to not believe in something. So it's not faith in no gods. And then you brought up the God of the gaps, and don't we evoke either the God of the gaps or the non-God of the gaps until we have a major scientific breakthrough? I don't think so. I don't think scientists think about, oh, are we going to evoke God or not God? I don't think about it that way personally. I mean, think about the things that we used to evoke God for, like the planetary motion of the sky, and because stars kind of move in circles around the planet, but that's because they're very far away, whereas Mars would move in a circle, and then it would move around us, but then it would stop and spin around, and then continue to move forward. Um, and like fire and lightning and thunderstorms. I mean, in our history as humanity, we've evoked the gods for lots of things. And every time we've tried to evoke a supernatural or mystic power, we've been wrong. I don't know why abiogenesis or anything like the Big Bang questions why all of a sudden evoking God now would make any more sense than what it used to be back when we thought lightning was thrown down by gods. So you said science does not really lend a hand to the origin of existence. I'm going to kind of treat that like its own thing, but you kind of explained that it wasn't what I initially thought it was about. But when it comes to like the beginning of the universe, most physicists talk about plausibility right now because it's hard to test like whether there's multiple dimensions. But I would definitely recommend Lawrence Krauss's book, which is A Universe from Nothing. Now, as far as non-believing scientists who do a good job at explaining kind of like evolution and stuff like that, I would definitely recommend Aron Ra. I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard of him already. Then you went on to clarify that the things that started life, essentially you were sounded like you were talking about biochemistry. We have some idea of how basic biochemistry can turn into amino acids, and we assume that from those amino acids, with enough time and the right conditions, you can move on to life, to more advanced biochemistry, until it bonds. And I don't know if that's the funnest thing to focus on, but again, I don't think that evoking any sort of intelligent supernatural being makes sense. And the last thing that I want to leave you with, because you were wanting to find out of kind of a harder version of atheism, like a version of atheism that could claim that God doesn't exist. Something that I find very compelling, but it does not make that claim. Let me be clear on that up front. Is the idea of Igtheism, which essentially says that if there is a version of God that is non-contradictory or doesn't break down into absurdity, I haven't heard it. I'm going to leave another link in the description, and I'll link all the things that I mentioned so far in the box below. And this is by the Messianic Manic, and he has some very interesting takes on it. So I hope that gives you some direction. Igtheism is something that I would recommend looking into because I think you'd find that fascinating. But as far as knowledge goes, I think we are limited on what we can know for as far as whether God exists or God doesn't exist. I would strongly lean towards the lack of belief in a God. Thank you guys, and again, welcome Wayne. Take care. Oh, and Peach, we will see you tomorrow. But you talked about the God of the gaps and the God of the not gaps. Again, that doesn't make much sense to me. Essentially, when you come up to the God of the gaps is by pointing out to things, say, hey, we have this gap in our knowledge. Now, that would be the God of the not gaps that you're talking about. But see how I'm not evoking anything? I'm just acknowledging that there's a gap in my knowledge or a gap in knowledge overall. But the God of the gaps comes up either one of two ways. Hey, there's this gap in our knowledge, therefore God, or hey, there's this gap in our knowledge, and the only possible explanation is God. Doesn't really, not a very strong argument.